This bird's-eye view still reminds us of what Aleppo used to be, a bustling economic hub boasting more than 2 million residents. Today, a closer look shows dismay. After 4 years of hellish battle, it is now estimated that the city is home to roughly 1/10 of that number, between 200,000 and 300,000.
Armed forces are only 500 meters away. You hear gunfire sometimes. Compared with before, the sound is always there, but much less, only sudden.
The ceasefire is welcomed. Everyone can go out at any time. Mothers can send kids to school, and people dare to go shopping.
Over in New York this past weekend, world leaders have been discussing the Syria issue. But with the truce drawing to an end, the road to peace now seems empty.
The official 7-day ceasefire declared by the Syrian army is now over. Warplanes in the sky, shelling apparently from both sides, small arms fire at the front line. It's quite clear that this was a ceasefire in name only. Yes, violence was reduced slightly, but the danger now is that it is all unraveling. The whole purpose of the ceasefire was to have aid delivered to the tens of thousands of people in the besieged part of this city in rebel-held eastern Aleppo. That hasn't happened. The aid is still stuck on 40 trucks on the Turkish border, and the UN aid chief says he's pained and disappointed that the aid has not got through to what he says are 275,000 people in desperate need of food, water and medical supplies. One rebel leader says the ceasefire deal brokered by the US and by Russia is now over and it has failed, and he says there's no hope of that aid being delivered. Now, the fear here is that all this will lead to a full-scale onslaught by the rebels, by the regime, or by both, and that this city will once again become a bloodbath.
The Syrian army has announced the end of the ceasefire, blaming rebels and citing over 300 violations of the agreement. Each side has accused the other of breaking the truce's terms.
Turning to Syria now, the international community of the Red Cross is postponing its relief work to reassess its security detail after a deadly attack on its staff. A UK-based monitor said 12 Red Crescent volunteers and drivers were killed in an airstrike late on Monday whilst delivering humanitarian aid to western Aleppo province. It came hours after the Syrian military declared an end to a week-long ceasefire.
Both Russia and the Syrian army deny carrying out an airstrike on a UN aid convoy near the Syrian city of Aleppo. Around 20 people, including a Red Crescent official, were killed in the attack. Russia's defense ministry says the bombing took place at the same time as rebels were carrying out a large-scale attack on southwest Aleppo. The Russian military said activists' video showed damage to vehicles that did not come from an airstrike.
The United Nations has suspended all aid convoys in Syria after its trucks were hit during a deadly air raid near Aleppo. At least 18 of the 31 vehicles which contained wheat, medicine and winter clothes were destroyed in Monday's attack while en route to the town of Urum al-Kubra. 12 aid workers and drivers were reportedly killed. The UN says the convoy had proper permits and was clearly marked. It has called for an investigation into the attack, with one official warning it could amount to a war crime if the strike was found to be deliberate.
Well, the ceasefire in Syria is over. Today, the Syrian army called for its end, but the US and Russia both hope they can salvage it. RT's Lizzie Phelan has more on those efforts.
Initially, it was expected that the Russians and the Americans would start cooperating and coordinating their air campaigns against both ISIL and the formerly named al-Nusra Front, now named Fatah al-Sham, after 7 days. But so far, both sides aren't exactly happy with how the truce went, and both are blaming each other for not meeting the terms for further cooperation. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry says that the truce was only observed by the Syrian government, and it gave rebels the opportunity to regroup. They also blame the Americans for not influencing the so-called moderate opposition further, and say that they failed to convince the moderate rebels to separate from groups like al-Nusra. In fact, they say that they've merged even further. At the same time, the opposition are blaming the government for violating the ceasefire. However, despite stopping short from fulfilling its goals, the ceasefire did bring some relief. In fact, John Kerry was optimistic today when he met with his Vatican counterpart. He said that the basic ceasefire was holding.
Secretary, is the ceasefire in Syria holding?
Pretty well last night. Trucks are moving today to maybe 8 locations or more. So, we'll see where we are today.
The United Nations has been forced to suspend aid convoys as a result of this outrage. The humanitarians delivering life-saving aid were heroes. Those who bombed them were cowards. Accountability for crimes such as these is essential. I appeal to all those with influence to end the fighting and get talks started. A political transition is long overdue.
Security forces in the Democratic Republic of Congo killed more than 50 people on Monday, according to the opposition, in a violent crackdown on anti-government demonstrators. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon has urged authorities to exercise maximum restraint as protesters in Kinshasa denounce what they see as President Joseph Kabila's bid to extend his mandate beyond the 2-term limit. We're defending our democracy, Kabila. We don't want you anymore.
At least 17 people have been killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo following a violent anti-government rally. There were ugly scenes in Kinshasa as protesters gathered to demand President Joseph Kabila step down. Banned from running for a 3rd term, his mandate is due to end in December. Security forces fired tear gas to disperse demonstrators on a main road in the capital. Police were also accused of using live ammunition. We're marching because we hate what's happening to our country, this protester said. Firstly, Kabila does not want to leave this country and does not want to recognise a vote. That's why today we are forced to protest to show our dissent for the 2016 elections. If Kabila does not respect the law, we will apply Article 64 of the Constitution. According to the country's Interior Minister, 3 policemen were among the dead. The DRC's National Electoral Commission was due to announce a date for the presidential election due in November on Monday, but has now said it is not possible to hold the ballot then.
South African police have arrested at least 31 students in Johannesburg following violent protests against educational reforms. Police threw stun grenades and tear gas to disperse student demonstrators at the University of Witwatersrand. The students are demanding the government scrap a recommendation allowing university tuition increases next year of up to 8%. That's higher than the country's inflation rate of 6%. Last year, student movement scored a victory after weeks of protests forced President Jacob Zuma to rule out a tuition hike in 2016.
North Korea has announced the testing of a new high-powered rocket engine for a geostationary satellite. Leader Kim Jong-un was quoted as ordering officials to get ready for a satellite launch as soon as possible. A South Korean spokesman said the new engine had improved thrust. Based on what North Korea announced, he says, we perceive that the engine thrust has improved. We will closely track and monitor for any possible additional movements of the North Korean military next month.